I'm so pleased to be welcoming Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David J. Garrow to Politics and Prose this evening to discuss his new book, Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama. In his detailed examination of President Obama's life before the White House, we see a man gearing up to become one of the greatest leaders of our time. That is my interpretation, not necessarily the author's. The Washington Post Review states, revealing and probing, Garrow tells us how Obama lived and explores the calculations he made in the decades leading up to his winning the presidency. Garrow portrays Obama as a man who ruthlessly compartmentalized his existence, who believed early on that he was fated for greatness, and who made emotional sacrifices in pursuit of a goal that must have seemed unlikely to many but him. From his birth in Hawaii to his formative years in Chicago and his 4 years in the Senate, at just shy of 1,500 pages, this is the most extensive and in-depth retelling of the life of this modern historical figure. David Garrow won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography, Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He is currently a professor of law and history and distinguished faculty scholar at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He's a regular contributor to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the American Prospect. Tonight he has a surprise guest with him, which I am going to let him introduce. So please help me welcome David J. Garrow to Politics and Prose.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for coming out in such lovely weather. It's been a horrible week in Washington in more ways than one. And the weather will probably get better before other things do. I've spent 9 years on this, and I've done over 1,000 interviews for it, one of which took place just about where we're sitting here tonight, because Susan Cole, who's been affiliated with Politics and Prose a good chunk of time over the years, was at Occidental College with Barack when Barack did his freshman and sophomore years there. And Susan had actually held on to some of their joint undergraduate project papers from a political science class. In addition to what you may have seen in some of the tabloid coverage the last week or so, there's an awful lot in this book about what Barack studied and read, whether in high school, in Hawaii, at Occidental, at Columbia, and then at Harvard Law School. But that experience with Susan is a great example of how I do history. Because one of the great virtues of when you go visit people in person, not just talk to them on the telephone, they make a real effort to go and look for what they have in the basement, in the attic, in the garage, next to the laundry machine, from years past. And throughout the 1980s, Barack Obama was a prolific letter writer. And so there are many friends, not just old girl friends, many friends who have these long handwritten letters. And then most importantly, or to me most substantively of all, and that's why our special guest is up here with me, during Barack's 3 years at Harvard Law School, Rob Fisher, who's very kindly joined me up here, who's been a wonderful companion in this work, with especially the Harvard chapter. Rob and Barack, during their time at Harvard, co-authored a 2-chapter, 244-page book manuscript that they never got around to publishing. There's a chapter on plant closings that certainly reflects the input of someone who had an economics PhD and had taught college economics for 6 years before going to law school. And as dozens and dozens of people who were in the class of 1991 at Harvard can attest, and as is richly, extensively documented in this book, Rob and Barack were very close intellectual companions during that 3 years, taking almost all of their classes together. And this book manuscript, half of it's about race. It's the sort of document that would have led to someone being Lonnie Guineared, if there are enough people in the room that go back to 1993 and what happened to Professor Guinier when folks decided to take some law review footnotes out of context. And there's certainly some things in that manuscript that would not be remarkable, I believe, to any of us in this room tonight, that nonetheless would have been raw meat for TV ads in 2008 or 2012. Let me say one other thing before I talk a little bit more about Rob and Harvard. Up through 1985, when Barack was leaving New York to first go to Chicago, everyone who had met him, friends, professors, classmates, thought he was a perfectly nice but utterly unremarkable guy. That's summer of 1985. Fast forward 3 years, when Barack and Rob and everyone else in the class of 1991 are arriving at Harvard to begin law school, I think it's accurate to say without exaggeration that from day one, everyone meeting Barack immediately recognized that this was a star person who would become a public figure of some renown in the years ahead. And that transformation is really the centerpiece of this book. And it's the story of how Barack transformed himself and how Black Chicago transformed him down in Roseland on the far south side between 1985 and 1988. Barack applies for and is offered and accepts this community organizing job in the summer of '85 after having lived a relatively directionless life in New York the previous 2 years. But he comes to realize pretty quickly that community organizing in relatively economically distressed neighborhoods is not a route to producing meaningful political change. But he's very impressed by the savvy and the persona and stance of Harold Washington, Chicago's first African-American mayor. Because Barack's 2 years there, Mayor Washington dies very suddenly, very tragically, late in 1987. But the example of Harold Washington plays a big part in leading Barack to think about politics as a career and a commitment, as a better path to achieving political change than working at a grassroots level. And it's that decision to pursue a political future that is what leads Barack to apply to and go to law school. His dad, a very tragic figure, serious alcoholic, violent abuser of women, died in a drunken car accident, 1982. Barack's father had been essentially thrown out of Harvard for reasons that in part were simply racist in 1965. I don't have a clear feeling about the extent to which Barack chose Harvard over a full ticket scholarship at Northwestern, just because Harvard was Harvard, or to what degree the family history might have played into that. But Barack's 3 years at Harvard, and particularly once he's elected as president of the Law Review, that's covered by the Times, the Boston Globe, I think it's very clear, and I'll ask Rob to talk about this. I think it's very clear that by the time that Barack is elected president of the Law Review in February of 1990, that everyone there believes that this is someone they're going to be reading about further in the papers in the years ahead. Now, let me stop there and turn to Rob. I mean, you can see in the acknowledgments at the back of this book how deeply thankful I've been to Rob for his support over these years. Rob found the first half of this book manuscript in his basement. His mother, just this past summer, 10, 11 months ago, found the second half of the manuscript. Rob has the hope that other relevant parties can be persuaded to have this whole thing published. I'm quoting from it within the bounds of fair use. And as many of you may have read, Barack read pretty much the whole manuscript of this book last summer. And that doesn't mean there are things he doesn't like in it. But I think the Harvard chapter is a really wonderful portrayal of what was a deeply intellectual, incredibly lively, deeply enjoyable experience for Barack. Something where he was an absolute academic star. One of my own great students, I won't call his name, is here tonight, who's in a similar sort of category, I'd argue. But Barack even has the experience in one of those classes at Harvard where his classroom comments during the semester are quoted on the final exam, asking he and his classmates to react to. Jerry Frug's local government class. So there's a lot in this book. I believe Carlos Lozada, in his wonderful, huge Washington Post review a week or so back, criticized me briefly for taking too much time in the book to cite how incredibly popular a professor Barack was when he begins teaching at the University of Chicago Law School in the 1990s. But there's an awful lot in this book about Barack's intellectual development, whether at the Punahou School, absolute elite, superb prep school in Hawaii, at Columbia, where one of his elective classes was entitled State Socialist Societies. That's why the transcripts have never been released. But it's a double irony, because the syllabus of State Socialist Societies is a roster of entirely critical readings about the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Milovan-Gilas, for people that know the old literature. So there's a lot of fun in this book about Barack's education, his intellectual development, and what a superb, non-political, non-ideological law teacher he was for a decade at the U of C Law School. So I've said enough. I want to, again, really thank and welcome Rob Fisher and ask Rob to just say a little bit to you about his friendship and intellectual relationship with Barack at Harvard. And for any of you who've ever read anything from the right wing about who helped Barack prepare Dreams from My Father, the answer is Rob Fisher, who once upon a time called himself a conservative Democrat from Southern Maryland, and not anyone who was ever tied to the Weather Underground. Rob Fisher.
I didn't know I'd be sitting up here tonight, but let me start by saying how humbling it is to sit here with a truly amazing historian. And to show you how things go full loop, when Barack and I were in law school together and we wrote a piece called Race and Rights Rhetoric. And we really went through the whole history of the civil rights movement, of the strategies behind it, of the ideology, and we talked about, and we did political analysis, and we talked about what are the right strategies going forward, and how there was a need for different strategies, for political strategies, for working class people who have similar interests to work across different identities and to work politically together. So that was the essence of it. But in that, we read Dave Garrow's book on Martin Luther King, and we cite it twice, right? So, things come full loop. So here's our educator right here. So
I put the titles in the book. The titles are in the text, but I didn't name the author.
So page 34 we cite it.
That's of the manuscript.
Yes. Of our manuscript, right. So my mom is 88 years old. In fact, Barack was in our wedding party when I got married in Southern Maryland, and so there's a picture of Barack walking down the aisle, because he was an usher, with my mom. So that's now in the church in Southern Maryland, right? So anyway, she's 88 years old, and she calls up last summer. She calls up my 17-year-old daughter, and she says, I just found this manuscript. It looks like it's the thing Barack and Rob wrote. It's called Race and Rights Rhetoric. Do you think that's important? And so she wants an autographed copy, by the way, from
Oh,
you
sure. Oh,
of
sure.
your book with
Okay.
acknowledgement that she found.
Oh, sure.
You know, so
Right,
that-
right.
She's very proud of that.
Okay, yes.
But
yes.
she has read the chapter. We got an advanced chapter, advanced copy of the book. So I had my mom read the chapter on Harvard, and she said, you know, sons don't tell their mothers enough about what they do in their lives and what happens. So she was aware I'd gone to Harvard. That was pretty much it. And she really felt like she got the blow by blow, day by day, moment by moment. They talked about this, they went over there, they thought about this, there was a controversy on this. And so my mother thanks you for your history of Harvard Law School. So Brock was the first person I met at Harvard Law School. We were in a little tutorial together on the first day, and we had a little exercise to cross-examine somebody on a little case study. And I did a pretty good job. And so he thought, this guy's interesting. He came up, shook my hand, said, I'm Barack Obama. And we were friends from there on. He is a remarkably deep thinker. I'd already been a professor of economics for a number of years. And at the stage when I met him, he was already a very mature, very deep thinker. We had very different views on lots of things, but our values were the same. You know, our concern for using ideas to explore the world and to solve real-world problems for people was the same, and it was a deep passion. And the other thing that I think is not common enough in the world, but it's very, very much true of Barack, is he always answered argument with argument. It was all about intellectual debate. So you think that, why do you think that? But what about this? And so it was nonstop talk between me and him, because we were just exploring the world with ideas. And it was a wonderful adventure. I massively enjoyed it. I didn't really think of it as anything peculiarly special at the time, because I think that's how you learn and that's what you do, a tremendous amount of enjoyment. We did, Barack ran circles around people, and the people at Harvard Law School, they all got summa cum laude here, magna cum laude here. They're phenomenally accomplished people. And, you know, he literally ran circles around people. He was a deep thinker, a fast thinker, very retentive mind. But the most powerful thing was his deep curiosity. And so both he and I are very interested in social issues, in how you address poverty, how you make the world a better place. So that's what we did. That's what we hung out and talked about that.
And I should underscore, Rob said this very obliquely, that both of them made the commitment in your 1L year to graduate magna cum laude, and they both succeeded.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Let me ask you too to say a little bit, because everyone laughed to a degree that you understood my implicit reference regarding Dreams from My Father and how it came to be, and who did not have any input into it. Say a little bit about your memories of Barack's struggle with trying to produce that book and how it evolved from its initial roots in a policy manuscript to becoming an autobiographical story.
Yeah, it started. The title originally was Journeys in Black and White, and it was a lot of his. He's pretty much read every piece of literature in the civil rights movement. Very, very deep reader. Really a scholarly person, and so a lot of it was working out his ideas about race identity, race relations, but within that. He told lots of anecdotes and lots of stories about himself. Here's a guy with, an African dad, a white mom from the Midwest, white Midwest grandparents, half brothers and half sisters in Africa, lives in Indonesia for part of his life, an anthropologist mom, lives with his grandparents for part of his life. He had identity issues, like, who am I? What group? I mean, this is your classic guy in literature who's the marginalized character. It's like, what group do I fit with? Who do I represent? And so a large part of what was in the book was also his personal struggle. And so he trusted me as a friend and as a good editor. And so I read very early drafts of it and gave him lots of comments on it. But then he, at some point I realized, the theoretical stuff, the historical stuff is of interest. But the most interesting thing here was his personal struggle and the way that brought up the idea, highlighted the difficulty of identity and what you do with that and what that means and what it doesn't mean and how you shape a life around that. So I said, you gotta get rid of this chapter, you gotta get rid of that chapter, you gotta get rid of this. This book needs to be about you. And so I think he agreed with that. He made it about him, and it made it more difficult to write because then he had to look deeper in his soul and think harder about the choices he had made and be a little bit more vulnerable. So, but it was a fun process. I think it's a beautiful book. Yeah.
Good, great, thank you. Let me say a little bit more, but not too much, because given how many folks we've got here tonight, I'd much rather us be able to do Q&A both with myself and with Rob. Once Barack goes back to Chicago after law school in 1991, he very much is focused on pursuing a political career. And when he gets into the Illinois state legislature and goes down to Springfield, he's in a Republican-dominated situation, very conservative Republicans, and he's very successful in establishing good social friendships with people across the aisle, with conservative white downstate Democrats. And it's not until Barack's 2 final years in the state legislature that Democrats take control. So he had 6 long years of experience in Springfield in working from a minority partisan position and doing so very well. I think that Barack's years in Springfield are crucial and essential to understanding the politician that he became. And there's been dramatically little written about his time in Springfield. A lot of the length or the heft, and I've gotten plenty of teasing this week about how much the book weighs. It's something just below 5 pounds. I had 2 long, wonderful hours earlier today with Brian Lamb, that'll be on television in 2 or 3 weeks or so. Just a phenomenal experience, but Brian in particular was teasing me about having to carry it around and the comments that his wife had made to him about it. But Barack's time in Springfield and the story of his successful 2004 U.S. Senate race is, I think, one of the most underappreciated parts of his story. Only the political embrace he received from Emil Jones Jr., old school African-American South Side Chicago politician, only Emil's support made Barack a credible candidate in Illinois statewide in '04. Chapter 9 of this book, which is the story of the Senate race, is, to my mind, a wonderful, though it is day by day, story of Illinois politics. And just as how Rob is a crucial but heretofore unacknowledged central figure in Barack's life, John Cooper, Kupper, political consultant in Chicago. John Cooper, like Rob, is someone who was really good at saving old documents, including all the email traffic from 2002 through 2004. I said this earlier. I mean, folks who save documents are, that's where history comes from. If we didn't have people like that, if we didn't have librarians and archivists, the historical record would be so much weaker. But the story of that Senate race is something that has great importance to me, because that's really Barack's real emergence as a successful statewide political figure, and someone who you can see in those months in the spring of 2004 is already well on the road to being the candidate everyone later saw in 2007, 2008, in '04, prior to the speech at the '04 convention that launched him to national fame. Is there anything else you'd like me to touch on before we?
Well, that's an interesting period of his life. I agree. He used to call me up when he'd be driving back and forth to Chicago from Springfield and tell me stories about it. But I remember that you mentioned in the book, actually, where my wife and I and Michelle and Barack have a meal near Boston after a wedding of a friend.
Dan,
and
right.
at that point, Barack had an offer of a $500,000 a year job running a massive charity, because he was sort of an up-and-coming, connected political type. People recognized he was something special.
I'm not quite endorsing that dollar amount. That's all.
That's But I don't know remember if you mentioned that part in the book.
Yeah.
But at this point, Michelle is like, "Look, you're off at Springfield making peanuts, constantly. We got little kids, and you got this offer of this great job." So the Senate race was up or out from Michelle's point of view. It was like, you either win this or you're getting another job. She was very practical. So that was the conversation we had at that dinner, which was quite memorable in retrospect.
Well, let me stop there, and again say great thanks to Rob. Given how many folks are here tonight, I'd rather, I know they're going to sort of call the clock on us at 8 o'clock, but I'd very much like to go around the room and people can ask me anything they'd like to raise, or alternatively, don't hesitate to ask Rob to talk a little bit more about Harvard and their relationship. Hi there.
Hi. I'm hooked. I was last night at the press
We were at
club.
the National Press Club last night, and this nice lady was there last night as well.
And you talked a lot about the girlfriends, so I don't want to ask that. But we didn't get last night to what I understand are some of the conclusions in that the Barack Obama of today is quite different than the one that was elected. So I missed in the conversation yesterday. So if you could talk about that.
Sure. I'd like to say two things, and I'm going to encourage Rob to disagree with me on the second part of this. The Barack Obama in Springfield, the Barack Obama up through 2001, 2002, is again and again a very outspoken progressive politician. Now, some of you here are going to know the story of how back in 1995-96, when Barack first begins running for the state legislature, he enthusiastically, in his own handwriting, endorsed gay marriage in 1995. That lasted about a year or so. And, he pulled back all the way until Joe Biden, you'll all remember this, until Joe Biden sort of, pushed the envelope. The Barack Obama, even of 2004, 2005, was a very outspoken critic of the Patriot Act, of the CIA, of the intelligence community. Barack in 2002, 2003 in the Senate race is a very strongly outspoken proponent of single-payer, universal health care coverage. Starting in 1997 down in Springfield, he'd been introducing a state constitutional resolution calling for universal coverage. I think, and here's where I'm going to encourage Rob to disagree with me, the conclusion I've come to after 9 years of immersion in this, and this is informed a good bit by all of my conversations with African American political folks in Chicago, is that after Barack's loss in 2000 in his congressional challenge to Congressman Bobby Rush, that as Barack moved towards this up or out decision for the 2004 Senate race, he developed a belief in the necessity of winning. And I can't say that strongly enough, that victory was what counted. And in making that choice, he started to become a different politician from whom he had been earlier. Now, the second thing I'll say, and here again I want to encourage Rob to disagree with me, but I think this is a good audience and a good community in which to say this. Barack Obama, up through 2004, lived a very modest middle-class life. In financial terms, they were stretched. They were strained. And Barack, up through 2004, 2005, had no interest in celebrities, in billionaires. And so I've had a really difficult time, both during the presidency and then again this spring, with processing how both Barack and Michelle in the White House became so infatuated with Hollywood. And we've seen it even more pointedly this spring. Richard Branson, Tom Hanks, Polynesian Islands, and now this decision to give a series of $400,000 speeches. So I don't have an easy answer for this. I don't want to put too much of a burden on Rob here, but the Barack Obama whom I think I know as a historian, many of you have read that I spent 8 hours with him last year, 3 different days at 1600. The Barack Obama whom I believe I know from 1985 to 2004, I have a lot of difficulty squaring that person with who he is now, very frankly. Let Rob disagree.
These are hard topics and delicate topics, obviously. But to me, same man, same values. Let me start with the 400,000. Work my way backwards. If somebody was on Wall Street was going to give me $400,000 to make a speech, and then I have the power to take that money and do what I want with it, like give it to charity or help some village get some water, I don't see any problem with taking that power into myself, which is available to me, and reallocating. In fact, that's what they did a few days later.
Okay.
One could argue they did it for PR purposes. I don't believe that.
Okay.
I believe, Brock knows he has enough money, and he is. If somebody's going to give him money who already has a lot of wealth, he's going to use that to do something constructive with somebody who doesn't. So
Okay.
I don't. That to me, that's using the power you have.
Okay.
So I'm okay with that. I think as far as the presidency goes, the presidency is a tough job. You see things that others don't see. I'll tell one story that's not a public story. I only asked Barack to do one favor for me while he was in the presidency. A friend of mine's brother was dying of cancer, and this man had spent 40 years in the CIA and was feeling very unappreciated by the country. And so I asked Barack to call him, and Barack did. And so it was a beautiful thing
great.
that he did. So that's the one favor I asked, and that's the kind of person that Barack is. The hardest thing for him to do was to send people in harm's way. It weighed on him in terms of, he understood, I think, and still understands that the politics is the art of the possible. We all have a view of a better world, and mine's different than his. His is different than yours, and mine's different than yours.
Right.
But getting to a better world is figuring out ways to talk to people you disagree with, to compromise on things you think are less important, maybe important, but less important to get to someplace you think is better. So sure, Barack compromised. I think he compromised a lot. I think he always did it with rigor of thought and with powerful principles in mind in terms of a vision of where he was trying to help the country get. Some of the things he did, I think he would disagree with too.
Right.
But he did them because he wanted to get to a better place.
Ma'am.
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. So I was actually curious after you mentioned that you had sort of devoured the history of the civil rights movement with Barack Obama. If you were familiar with the article that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in the Atlantic at the end of last year, where he also spent a lot of time with President Obama, asking him about his life history and all of that. And one of the theories that Ta-Nehisi Coates has in his piece is that one of the reasons that Barack Obama was able to get as far as he could was because in essence, he was a very optimistic man, and he had never grown up with the negativism that a lot of the folks of the black community actually have against white people. And so he had a very positive vision of whites, basically. And so I'm wondering if you, in in your hours, countless of hours spending time with him, if what your reaction to that is, does that describe him? Would he agree with that, with what Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about him in the Atlantic?
Let me briefly say two things, and it's been so long since I read that article that I don't have a particularly clear recollection of it. In Black Chicago, even when Barack is first becoming active in 1994, 1995, and Carol Harwell, who was Barack's first campaign manager, Carol says this, it's in the book, it's very, very powerful to me. Paul Williams, former African-American Southside legislator, Paul says a very similar thing. Lifelong Southside Black Chicagoans did not view Barack as black because, having grown up in Hawaii, he lacked that depth. I wish I could come up with better adjectives. Depth of often bad, painful experience that they all had. I believe I'm very close to quoting Carol word for word accurate on this, but Barack Obama did not know what it meant to be a black man in Chicago. And Carol's an experienced West Side political operative, works in the Cook County Clerk's office. The second thing I'd ask, and Rob may remember this better than I do, is in the race chapter, I believe there is a discussion of reparations, because that's part of the Coates article. And again, this has been some months since I read this. You've read it more recently. I believe the conclusion in that chapter is that it is so politically impractical that it's not worth pursuing. But I'd rather have you characterize. Okay, you characterize it. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir.
You what you said reminded me of something that Katrina Vanden Heuvel, who was editor of Nation, said in this room. She said Barack told her, "Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good." My question was, particularly we have this classmate from Harvard. Lawrence Tribe said in his 40 years of teaching, he'd never had a more brilliant student than Barack. Is that? Could you comment on that?
I think there's a little poetic exaggeration there, but
No, actually, I would say that's true. He was a stunningly brilliant student, the truth is, I know Larry Tribe won't like this. He ran circles around Larry Tribe. I do have a quick comment on the identity issue.
Oh, sure.
I think Barack went through a lot of identity pain, right? I mean, he was a little African-American kid in Indonesia who looked completely different than everybody. So he had lots of experience with identity issues. And I don't know what his ultimate take on that experience is emotionally, but my sense of Barack was that the kinds of scars he carried were actually quite different than the typical kinds of scars you experience when you are interacting with an African-American person who's spent their whole life here in a difficult community or an impoverished community. It's different, and you could sense that difference in a different kind of set of scars. And I think part of in him looking for his own identity and a home for himself and a community for himself, because he was a very marginalized figure, I think part of his deep love and attraction for Michelle and his passion for Michelle was very much that part of it was that she was deeply embedded in a community that he could attach himself to. He was different, he's a marginalized figure, but that he could embrace and play a significant role in. So I think that's part of the resolution and part of the beautiful story of this young, confused man trying to find his way in the world. He's a brilliant man, and figure out how he can be constructive, how he can turn himself into a healthy, productive human being. So I think that's part of the story, is how he deals with those different kinds of pain.
Great, thank you. Ma'am.
Well, you just broached the topic I was going to bring up, which is you didn't mention Michelle in your presentation. I'm sure she's there somewhere.
Oh, right.
And I'd like to hear more about how they got together and her influence on him in the early days and vice versa when she wasn't particularly political.
Right. They first meet in the summer of 1989. You're in Sidley that same summer, I believe, when Barack is a summer associate, and Michelle is his mentor. I think what I would stress more than anything else, in this, I'm trying to link this back to some of what we've touched on already, is how Michelle's own upbringing as a black person on the south side of Chicago had left her very leery about politics. It had also left her very leery about the University of Chicago. And as Rob touched on earlier, Michelle has gone to this big corporate law firm, Sidley and Austin, where she was uncomfortable. When Michelle herself, they did not overlap at Harvard, but when Michelle was herself at Harvard Law School, she wrote a very remarkable piece in the Black Law Students newsletter, which I quote at some length, which I don't believe has ever been used before, really underscoring how uncomfortable she felt as a black woman at Harvard. Her undergraduate thesis at Princeton, which has been written about, I think, by Politico back in the campaign, that undergraduate thesis very powerfully talks about how incredibly uncomfortable she felt as a black woman as an undergraduate at Princeton. So Michelle's racial identity, having gone to Princeton, gone to Harvard, coming back to Chicago, as Rob said this better than I can about what a role that had in grounding Barack. But the other thing that I would really stress, and that's in the book a lot, is how very hesitant and dubious Michelle was from 1995 right on up through 2003 about Barack, continuing to make this commitment to electoral politics. There's another story parallel to the one about the Joyce Foundation presidency, where people who were at a dinner party remember Michelle sort of baiting Barack and saying, "Oh, you'd have more of an impact being a high school principal than being a state senator." Bayard, and I should warn all of you. The next questioner is a superb former student of mine who's going to Mississippi this summer to work at a community level. Bayard.
Hi, I'm Mr. Garrow, professor. My question is, I think it's really interesting connecting the two ideas that Barack Obama was a man with an identity crisis, and the fact that he was very good at befriending and working with people from the other side of the political aisle. For example, like you, conservative Democrat, doesn't exactly align with Barack Obama's stance from, as you said, 91 to 2004. But during his presidency, he hasn't been incredibly successful at befriending Republicans. In fact, this is the most polarized Congress has been in a very, very long time. So what do you think happened? Why was he so good at getting along with conservative politicians in the state house? And then why was he so unsuccessful at the federal level?
Right. Yeah, I don't have a good theory of that. I think the country has gotten very fragmented. The people all look at the whatever literature and news they think reinforces their own beliefs. There are certainly structural issues at the federal level that are challenging to reach sensible compromises. So I don't know enough about it. That's why I don't think he'll do it, but I want him to write the history of the presidency because I want to figure that out and I want all the details. But I don't know enough about it to have the answer to that. I think it's a great question, and I just don't know what the answer is. I think it's a really challenging environment for people across the spectrum who do want to work in a constructive way. So.
I'd say a little bit, just very briefly. Julie Mason, former White House correspondent, asked me a very similar question at Sirius Radio this afternoon. As we again are seeing in the present day, in a much worse way, I think being in the White House can separate people from interactions and conversations with folks who could better advise them, remind them who they are. We saw a number of times during the last year of Barack's presidency, how he alluded even publicly to feeling that he'd been living in the bubble for too long. And again, my book is 96% pre-2007, but I do not believe that he was tremendously well advised, particularly during some of the early years of the presidency. But that's a personal opinion. That's not a historian's conclusion like most of the rest of the book is. Ma'am.
Hi. I haven't read your book, but I certainly read the Post piece. And thank you for being such a good friend. Absolutely, it's very important. Michelle is good for him. Michelle is the descendant of people who were enslaved in Georgetown, South Carolina, where she and her brother used to go and spend summers. A long history of degradation, and you name it.
Right.
Charleston, all that area, Georgetown would still be a swamp if it wasn't for those 500,000 rice plantations in Georgetown in and of itself. So that's where the money was and why it was the wealthiest city in the South. Now, having said that, and based on the migration of her grandparents and parents and where they came from, that makes it very clear about her identity, and that's why she is so good for him. And also the fear of whether or not something would happen to him.
Oh, boy.
That's the reality
Oh, boy.
of
Yes.
racism
Yes,
in
yes,
the
yes.
United States of America. It has always been there. It's still there.
I am a distant cousin of Barack Obama.
Ah,
I have
with roots in Kansas?
No, Teague. It's the Teague ancestor.
Oh, okay.
And the reason I bring it up, it's nice to say that in front of a bunch of people, for one thing. And the other thing is that the reason I really latched on to this connection was because when I read the biography of his mother,
Well,
this
is by Janie Scott. It's an excellent book.
I said to my friends and my sisters and my family that this woman reminded me so much of the women in my family. And we were raised in Japan and grew up abroad. And so when you've been talking tonight about this multiculturalism of really what is beyond race, including national identity, but also the effect of living and growing up as a child in another country and becoming what we call third culture kids.
Right.
So from that point on in early childhood, you never feel that you belong, or you're constantly having to redefine your identity. So there's a negative side, of course, which is that you feel sort of out there. And the other side, though, is that you're able to embrace many cultures and many points of view.
Right.
And I think as one of the legacies of Barack Obama is this wonderful ability to bring us together. I think there's just something about it that has a lot to do, I think, with his childhood.
Great. Well, thank you. Sir.
This question might sound adversarial, but I would like your take on it and your take on it also, Rob, if you have anything for the good of the order. In your preliminary remarks, you alluded to success that Barack Obama enjoyed in Springfield in a predominantly conservative atmosphere. Now, skip ahead, probably beyond the end of where your book ends. Barack Obama had some severe challenges in dealing with a conservative Republican Congress, and not only a conservative Republican Congress, at times it was controlled by Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi and
right.
company. And he apparently, in an act of frustration, did resort to the executive order
Right.
as the principal means of government. I'd like your comment on it.
That's outside my ambit, as I think you realize. I think we're seeing already that government by executive order or government by what you publish in the Federal Register, is subject to pushback or revocation, especially with this Congressional Review Act. But that's none of that is material that I know particularly well as a scholar. Do you want to add anything or not?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, is this working? Yeah. Those are difficult issues. The issues of sort of balance of powers, between the different branches and how they're used. I know how Barack thinks about the world, and I think his thinking about the world would have been, okay, I'm trying to do certain concrete things that I think are good, and he would, I'm sure he would push the boundaries of that power to do what he thought was right, as I think most presidents would. And so whether it's the right institution or the right mechanism, I think is a deeper and a harder question. And that's for another day.
Yeah. Sir.
Yes, my name is Fred, and my question has to do with his comment about the book title not being Journeys of Black and White. I was encouraged to read Dreams of My Father immediately after his convention speech that propelled him. And I was wowed like everyone else. And having a sports background, when I was reading it, okay, I was trying to put together the disparate parts of his personality. And he started reading Malcolm X. The gentleman he met in Hawaii who was radically black.
Frank Marshall Davis.
Exactly. He was dabbling with drugs.
Right.
Okay. So you got so many desperate parts that you have to bring together and come up with this personality. So I'm asking, when he, before college, when he was in high school and he was playing sports.
Yes.
And he was reading these books about blacks, men, trying to congeal some kind of personality persona. I'd like to know, at least with my black experience, because when he gets to Chicago, he's basically convinced of who he is, but he's not grounded.
Exactly.
Who he is, because he doesn't have this hoodlum, like Stevie Wonder would say, hanging out with my hoodlum friends of mine in the song. Okay, they didn't have hoodlum friends in Hawaii.
Right.
Sort of like the south side of Chicago. I'm from Cleveland, but every time I hear the south side of Chicago, there's so many similarities that I don't have to be from the south side of Chicago. So I just want to minimize my speech, but I was really into the Dreams of My Father. How do you go from Journey of Blacks and White to what did his father have to do with the title when he went to his father's grave and he broke down crying? I mean, it's like these desperate parts I'm still wrestling with. Okay?
This is a great question because, and I'm putting Rob on the spot in a very detailed way, but it's in the book. I'll let Rob say it, but the title changed from Dreams of My Father to Dreams from My Father.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, and the reason for that was he didn't really know his father. Right?
So it's not splitting hairs.
So no, it was because Dreams from his father he's trying to construct his father.
Right.
He's kind of trying to construct his background. He's trying to.
I got that.
Yeah, I mean, the way you expressed it was perfect.
Yeah.
I can't express it better than you. That is the struggles he was facing. But I can tell you this: he was inspired. As pertinent to the speech we got over here, he was inspired by the struggles of the African American community. I don't think he didn't live it. I think that's true, but he was deeply inspired by it. And the other thing he was inspired, he loves sports. He loves basketball.
Right.
He loves Michael Jordan.
Right.
You know, I mean, we would sit there a lot watching Michael. you know.
Not to cut you off,
So,
but
yeah.
continue, but briefly end up how Jeremiah Wright had an impact on his life as a father figure.
I can take it. I mean, I have tremendous regard for Reverend Wright. I mean, but this comes from my background in writing about Martin Luther King, and one of my oldest, closest friends, James H. Cone, regarded as the founder of Black liberation theology. Wonderful man. And what Jeremiah did with Trinity Church, and Jim has said this in print, is really the actualization of what Jim as a theologian, Cornel West as a theologian, hoped for. Now, whether you're Jeremiah Wright or anyone else, people should not be judged by history based on the 3 stupidest things they've ever said in their lives. I believe I said that in almost exactly those same words to Brian Lamb 8 hours or so ago. Reverend Wright was indeed to some degree a father figure for Barack when Barack was age 26 or so. But even though Barack and Michelle joined Trinity Church in 1992 in preparation for getting married, Barack and Michelle were not there at Trinity every Sunday. They weren't there for either of Reverend Wright's most notorious YouTube clips. And so, in terms of Reverend Wright's sermons and preaching, those should not be held against Barack. Sir.
Yeah, I'm haven't read your book. I hadn't seen it before tonight, but I've read reviews and so on. I'm curious, even though you're a historian and focus on individuals, I'm curious to what degree the sort of the compartmentalization and so on that you haven't talked about, but I guess is central to your book, is really distinctive about Barack Obama, or how much it's on anybody who decides fairly early in life what they want to do, whether we're John McCain divorcing and marrying a family and a woman in Arizona to get into Arizona, or CEOs who do things to move.
Right.
So I'm curious, really, not just about what you've written about Obama, but how he's distinctive from all kinds of other really successful people who decide early to focus.
I think compartmentalization is one of the most crucial words for understanding Barack, at least as I understand him. The Alinsky community organizing tradition, which Barack was very intensely inculcated in from 85 to 88. The Alinsky tradition, as represented by Greg Galuzzo and Mike Kruglich and Jerry Kelman, taught young organizers to absolutely separate their work lives from their personal lives. And that's what Barack lived in Hyde Park between 1985 and 1988. As you may well have read, he spends most of that time living with a young woman who's half Dutch, half Japanese. Wonderful lady, scholar herself. But virtually no one from Barack's community group, the community organizing guys, no one ever met, other than one or two very passingly, the woman with whom he's living. Similarly, she never had any exposure to Barack's workaday world. I think that ability to separate, to compartmentalize, I think that's a very central part of who Barack became. Ma'am?
So I have a question about your approach. Because, so you wrote the story of a man who is a person of color in America. And so, presumably, if you are white passing or a white man in the US, you don't have the lived experience of being a person of color. So what kind of work did you do to look beyond the lens of whiteness to write his story?
I started meeting and talking with all of the people who worked with Dr. King in September of 1979. The civil rights world back at that time had not really been discovered by academic history. I mean, civil rights history the last 15 years has morphed in a much larger way. And I was so young in 1979 that I didn't realize how close in time 1968 still was to 1979. To me, as a 26-year-old, 11 years seemed, well, hey. But I've ended up spending an awful lot of my life in majority African-American situations. I talked a little bit earlier about Jim Cone, about Reverend Wright, about Cornel West. At the end of the day, I'm always a white boy. There's no question about that, needless to say. But especially with Barack's life from the 85 to 88 period, and thankfully this was for me 6 years ago rather than, say, 1 year ago, the crucial thing is to go down there on the far south side and meet the people. And that's true of Reverend Wright. It's true of some of the people in that congregation. Many of the other congregations that Barack had worked with during those years were Roman Catholic. There's a somewhat bemusing sidebar controversy about how the Archdiocese of Chicago actually paid for Barack's community organizing training. Conservative Catholics think that's a terribly scandalous thing. But I do not believe that race lies at the center of who Barack is. I actually believe that the experience of the presidency made Barack more conscious of his blackness than he was when he was inaugurated. That's a conversation I'd like to have. I'm not looking just at Rob. That's a discussion for another day. It's a thought I've not yet really been in a position to write about.
If I could give a quick comment on that. Dave Garrow is very special in the following way, I think. I'm sitting next to Sherlock Holmes here. And people place narratives on things, and they interpret the world in terms of narratives. And Dave has the narrative. He's put some narrative on it. But this book is almost like an original source. If you go into this book, he's talked to so many people. He's gotten all their different viewpoints and comments on the events, and he puts it in there. And the profound respect for the reader, to let the reader go into that moment and decide for themselves who's Barack Obama, what's important about this journey. So it's a beautiful document in that sense that he's such a good historian and has such a passion for truth that it really does transcend his identity and his set of narratives. And that's what's, I think, very special about this book.
Oh, thank you, Rob. Now, I had promised our sponsors that I would pay attention to the clock, and I have failed because we're 5 minutes over time. So
Oh, okay.
Sure.
So in 4 years, when the party divides between, say, a Biden and a Sanders wing, where do you think he stands?
Where he stands, I'm not sure that divide's going to happen. I mean, I identify more with the Sanders wing, but I don't prognosticate on that. I should say thank you to everyone here for coming out on such a monsoon-like night, and huge thanks to Rob for making this historically valuable.